Welcome to my YouTube channel. Hit the like button, share your thoughts, subscribe and tap the bell icon. Lena had never been one to doubt herself. She had grown up with little, but she had always believed that if you worked hard enough, you could rise above anything. Life had a way of knocking you down, but she'd learned to pick herself back up. She'd learned that strength came from surviving, from pushing through when it seemed impossible. But tonight? Tonight felt different. She stood at the entrance of Le Chateau, the most exclusive restaurant in the city, its gold-trimmed doors towering above her. The name alone struck fear in the hearts of most people. It wasn't a place for someone like her. Lena had never been one for luxury, never been someone who understood the rules of high society. Her jeans, faded and worn from countless days of working late shifts at a small cafe, felt out of place next to the expensive silk suits and designer gowns that passed by her. The moment she stepped inside, she felt the stares. They were inevitable, she told herself. People always looked at the unfamiliar. But these weren't just looks of curiosity. They were judgment. Cold, uninviting eyes that scanned her from head to toe. The waiter, a young man with a slicked-back hairstyle, barely acknowledged her as he gestured for her to follow him. The lavish decor of the restaurant didn't escape her: plush velvet chairs, sparkling crystal chandeliers, and fine china that looked like it belonged in a museum rather than on a dinner table. But Lena had no time to admire the elegance of the place. She had come here for a reason. A very specific reason. Her heart pounded as she was led to a table in the back. She could feel the weight of everyone's gaze on her, each step she took echoing in her ears. They knew she didn't belong here. They could tell she was out of place. But they had no idea what she had endured to even get this far. She took her seat, her palms slick against the table. Her fingers clutched her purse, the only thing that felt familiar in this strange, cold environment. She tried to steady her breath, to calm the racing thoughts in her head. She wasn't here to make friends. She wasn't here to impress anyone. She was here to prove something. To herself. To the world. But as the minutes ticked by, the whispers started. They were low at first, so quiet she almost convinced herself they weren't real. Look at her. What is she doing here? Isn't she out of place? Who let someone like that in? Lena didn't look up. She kept her eyes focused on the menu in front of her, trying to decipher the unfamiliar names of dishes she could barely pronounce. She wasn't interested in food. She wasn't interested in the surroundings. She just needed to stay focused, stay calm. But it was impossible to ignore the murmurs. The laughter that followed. She forced herself to ignore them, but it wasn't easy. Every glance, every snicker felt like a stab in her chest. She could hear the mocking tone in their voices. She could feel the weight of their judgment. "Excuse me, miss," a voice interrupted her thoughts. It was the waiter again, his tone stiff and formal. "Can I take your order?" Lena glanced up, meeting his gaze briefly. His expression was polite, but she could see the faint trace of amusement in his eyes. She felt a flicker of anger rise in her chest. She wasn't some kind of joke to be laughed at. But she held her composure. "I'll have the steak, medium rare," she said, her voice steady, though the words felt foreign on her tongue. The waiter nodded and turned to leave, but before he could take a step, the laughter from the table across the room grew louder. It was unmistakable, the sound of people mocking her. She tried to ignore it, but the heat in her cheeks betrayed her. She felt the sting of their words like a slap across her face. She wasn't used to this. "Look at her. She doesn't even know how to dress for a place like this," one of them sneered. Lena bit her lip, fighting the urge to stand up and confront them. She wasn't the type to start trouble. But tonight, with every glance, every whisper, she felt like her whole world was falling apart. She wasn't prepared for this. Not this level of scorn. And then, just as she thought she might break under the pressure, she heard a voice. It was soft at first, barely a whisper above the ambient chatter, but it cut through the noise like a blade. "Excuse me. You need to leave." The words echoed in her mind, but she didn't move. She didn't understand. Was it directed at her? But then the voice grew louder, clearer. It was the man at the table across the room. The one who had been laughing moments before. The one who seemed to take great pleasure in mocking her. His eyes locked with hers, and she felt a chill run down her spine. "You're in the wrong place. People like you don't belong here," he said, his voice sharp, dismissive. Lena's heart thudded in her chest. The nerve. The audacity. How dare he speak to her like that? She opened her mouth to say something, to defend herself, but the words caught in her throat. What was there to say? How could she possibly explain that she didn't come from a world like theirs? That she wasn't used to this level of wealth and pretension? Before she could gather herself, the waiter returned, his eyes flicking nervously between Lena and the table of mockers. "I'm terribly sorry, ma'am," he said, avoiding her gaze. "It seems there's been a misunderstanding. You'll need to leave." Her breath caught in her throat. Was this really happening? Were they actually asking her to leave? Lena's mind raced. She had worked so hard for this moment. She had put everything she had into this night, this dinner. It was supposed to be a fresh start, a chance to step into a world that had always felt so far out of reach. But now, it was slipping through her fingers. "Please, just give me a moment," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The waiter hesitated, but he didn't budge. "I'm afraid I can't do that, ma'am." Lena felt her heart sink. The humiliation burned in her chest. But just as she thought she couldn't take another second of this, the door to the restaurant swung open. The wind from outside swept into the room, bringing with it a sharp, sudden chill. The room stilled. It was as though time itself paused. Everyone turned to look at the figure who had just entered. Tall, confident, and dressed in a tailored suit that could only have come from the finest designer, the man who walked in was unmistakable. His presence filled the room with an undeniable force. Lena's breath caught in her throat. She didn't recognize him, but there was something about him, something that made the world seem to shrink around her. He looked around the room for a moment before his gaze settled on her. His eyes locked with hers, and for a brief moment, everything else disappeared. The laughter, the whispers, the mocking stares, they all faded into nothing. And then he spoke, his voice carrying across the room, cutting through the thick tension. "Lena," he said, his tone calm, yet filled with an authority that made the rest of the room fall silent. Lena's heart skipped a beat. She didn't know this man. She couldn't place him, but there was something about the way he said her name that felt familiar. The whispers began again, this time with a different tone. Confusion replaced mockery. People began to murmur, wondering who this man was, why he was speaking to Lena. "Who is that?" someone asked in a hushed tone. "I don't know, but he's commanding," another replied. Lena's head spun. She couldn't make sense of it. Who was this man? Why was he here? Why did he call her by name? And then, he smiled, a slow, almost knowing smile. He walked toward her, the air around him shifting with every step he took. He stopped at her table, his gaze never leaving hers. The room held its breath. He looked at the waiter, who had stiffened at his approach, and then back at Lena. "Lena," he repeated, his voice softer this time. "We need to talk." Her heart raced as the room buzzed with whispers. What was happening? Why was this man here? Why was he speaking to her like that? The questions swirled in her mind, but before she could speak, he turned to the stunned crowd. "Meet my wife," he said, his voice filled with a quiet confidence that sent shockwaves through the room. The laughter died instantly. The whispers stopped. Everyone was looking at her now, their eyes wide with disbelief. And Lena? She was too stunned to speak. The room was silent, save for the soft clinking of silverware and the murmur of confused voices. Lena couldn't move. Her body was frozen, every nerve alive with a storm of questions. Had she heard him right? Did he really just call her his wife? The word wife echoed in her mind, ricocheting off every corner of her consciousness. She had no idea who this man was. She had never seen him before in her life, and yet, there he was, standing before her, as if they were in the middle of some scripted drama that made no sense. The waiter, who had been hovering nervously, stood in shock. His eyes darted between Lena and the stranger with the air of someone witnessing an impossible scene unfold. The entire restaurant had fallen into a state of stunned disbelief. Lena tried to speak but the words wouldn't come. She opened her mouth, closed it again. Her heart pounded in her chest like a war drum, the sound almost deafening in her ears. The man, the stranger who claimed to be her husband, was still standing there, his posture relaxed but his gaze unyielding. It was as if he wasn't even concerned about the fact that the entire room was watching them. As if it was perfectly normal for a man to walk into an upscale restaurant, announce that the woman seated at the table was his wife, and make every person within earshot feel like they had just stumbled onto something they weren't supposed to see. The air felt heavy, thick with tension. Lena's hands trembled, and she clutched the edge of the table for support, hoping that somehow, it would anchor her in this surreal moment. But it didn't. She was still adrift, lost, and confused. He smiled again, that slow, knowing smile that sent shivers down her spine. There was something almost too calm about him. It wasn't the warmth of a man who had just greeted his wife after a long separation. No. This was something else. This was a man who had control over the situation, a man who expected things to go his way. "I'm sorry for the confusion," he said, his voice smooth like silk, but there was a sharpness underneath that Lena couldn't ignore. "But Lena and I have some business to attend to." Business? The word hit her like a slap. There was no business between her and this man. There couldn't be. The man turned to the waiter, who was still standing there like a deer caught in headlights. "I'll be taking her from here," he said, and there was no mistaking the authority in his voice. The waiter seemed to snap out of his stupor, nodded quickly, and disappeared into the back of the restaurant without another word. The silence in the room was palpable, but it didn't last long. As soon as the waiter was gone, the whispers started again, louder this time, a low buzz of speculation. People began to murmur among themselves, their voices rising in excitement. The woman at the table, his wife, didn't belong here, and yet, here she was. Lena tried to make sense of it all, but the pieces wouldn't fit together. She stood up, her knees shaky, and looked the man in the eye for the first time. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice barely more than a whisper, but the words were sharp, cutting through the confusion like a knife. She wasn't sure if she was speaking to him, or to herself, trying to make sense of the chaos that had suddenly become her life. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he studied her for a long moment, his eyes dark and unreadable. Then, without warning, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small, silver card. He placed it on the table in front of her. Lena looked at it, then back up at him. The card was simple, just a name and a number. No logos. No business address. No hint of who he was or what he did. "I think this will help you understand," he said, his voice low and calm. "You may not remember me now, but you will. Soon enough, you'll know everything." Lena stared at the card, her mind racing. She didn't know what was happening, but she knew one thing for sure, she needed answers. The man turned toward the door, his back to her now. "Come with me," he said over his shoulder. It wasn't a request. It was a command. Lena's pulse raced. She didn't know what was happening, but she couldn't stay here. Not like this. The restaurant had become suffocating, the walls closing in on her. She had to get out. Without thinking, she grabbed the card and followed him. Her legs felt like lead, each step heavier than the last. The door to the restaurant swung open again, and the cool evening air hit her like a wave. She barely noticed it as she stepped out onto the sidewalk, her eyes focused on the man ahead of her. He led her down a narrow alley, the city's noise fading as they walked farther from the bustling restaurant. It was quiet here, eerily so. She felt exposed, alone, her every step a reminder that she was walking into the unknown. Finally, he stopped in front of a sleek, black car that gleamed under the streetlights. The man didn't say anything as he opened the door for her, his hand resting lightly on the handle. His gaze didn't waver. It was clear he wasn't going to let her go. Not until he got what he wanted. Lena hesitated. She had no idea where this man was taking her. For all she knew, she could be walking straight into a trap. But the card in her hand was a clue. It was the only thing that could help her piece this together. And somehow, deep down, she knew she had no choice. With a shaky breath, she slid into the car, the leather seats cool against her skin. The man followed her in, the door shutting with a soft click behind him. The car moved smoothly through the city streets, the lights of the city flickering past her window like memories she couldn't quite grasp. She didn't know where they were going, but she couldn't bring herself to ask. Her mind was too occupied with the questions that continued to race through her head. Who was he? How did he know her name? Why had he called her his wife? The questions multiplied with every passing second. But one thing was clear, nothing in her life was what it seemed. The man didn't speak, didn't offer any explanation. He sat there, calm and composed, his hands folded in his lap, as if this was all just a normal day. As if he didn't have the power to shatter everything she thought she knew about herself. Lena glanced at the card again, turning it over in her hands. She had to know what it meant. She had to understand why this man was so intent on dragging her into his world. After what felt like an eternity, the car pulled up in front of a tall, glass building. It was sleek and modern, its sharp lines cutting through the night sky like a blade. The man gestured toward the building, his eyes flicking to her with a quiet intensity. "We're here," he said. "Time to get some answers." Lena stepped out of the car, her legs unsteady. This was it. The moment when everything would be revealed. The truth she had been desperately searching for. But she couldn't shake the feeling that what she was about to learn would change everything. And she wasn't sure if she was ready for it. The building loomed above her, a modern fortress of glass and steel. Lena stood there for a moment, the cool breeze tugging at her hair, her heart hammering in her chest. The man who had just called her his wife had led her to this place, a sleek high-rise in the heart of the city. It felt like something out of a movie, a scene she wasn't supposed to be in, and yet here she was, caught in the middle of something she didn't understand. The man led the way, his footsteps echoing in the quiet night. His stride was confident, each movement measured and purposeful, like he had done this 1,000 times. Lena couldn't help but feel like she was stumbling through a dream, unable to wake up. Her mind raced, trying to connect the dots, trying to figure out who this man was, why he knew her name, and why he seemed to have control over her life. As they entered the building, Lena couldn't help but feel a sense of awe. The lobby was grand, with marble floors that gleamed under the soft lighting. Everything about this place screamed wealth and power. It wasn't the kind of place someone like her belonged. The man didn't pause to look around. He walked straight to the elevator, his eyes fixed ahead. Lena followed, her feet dragging with each step. She wanted to speak, to demand answers, but the words stuck in her throat. She had no idea what was going on, and part of her was afraid to ask. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime, and they stepped inside. The man pressed the button for the top floor, and the doors slid shut with a quiet hiss. The elevator rose slowly, the city lights growing smaller beneath them. Lena stared at her reflection in the polished metal walls, watching the uncertainty and fear flicker across her face. "Who are you?" she finally asked, her voice trembling despite herself. She could no longer hold it in. The questions had been piling up inside her, and she had to know. She had to understand what was happening. The man turned his gaze toward her, his eyes dark and unreadable. For a moment, he didn't speak, just watched her with an intensity that made her skin crawl. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and steady. "You really don't remember, do you?" Lena frowned, confused. "Remember what?" He leaned back against the wall of the elevator, his hands clasped in front of him. "Your life, Lena. You don't remember who you were before all of this? Before I found you?" The words hit her like a punch to the gut. "Before I found you?" What was he talking about? She didn't understand, and the confusion in her mind only deepened. "I don't understand," Lena said, her voice barely above a whisper. "What are you talking about? I don't even know who you are." The man's expression softened, but there was no warmth in it. It was almost as if he was pitying her. "I'm sorry, Lena. I really am. But you have to remember. You have to understand what's at stake here." Lena's heart pounded in her chest. What did he mean by that? What was at stake? Her mind raced, but the more she thought about it, the more the pieces refused to fit together. The elevator dinged softly as they reached the top floor. The doors opened, and the man stepped out first, turning to offer his hand to Lena. She hesitated for a moment before accepting, her fingers brushing against his. The touch sent a strange shiver down her spine, and she couldn't quite explain why. The hallway was quiet, and the air felt heavy, like something important was about to happen. The man led her down the corridor, his footsteps echoing against the marble floors. He stopped in front of a large wooden door, one that looked like it belonged in a place far grander than this building. He turned the handle and stepped inside, motioning for her to follow. Lena walked in, her eyes immediately drawn to the view. The room was vast, with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a breathtaking panorama of the city. But it wasn't the view that caught her attention. It was the room itself, the bookshelves, the paintings on the walls, the large desk covered in papers. It looked like a place where decisions were made, where lives were changed. The man walked to the desk and sat down in the leather chair behind it, his eyes never leaving Lena's face. "Sit down, Lena. We need to talk." Lena didn't argue. She took a seat in one of the chairs across from him, her body tense, her mind spinning. She still had no idea who this man was, or why he had brought her here. But whatever he had to say, it was clear that it was important. It was the key to understanding everything. The man didn't speak at first. Instead, he reached into the drawer of his desk and pulled out a file. It was thick, the edges worn as if it had been handled countless times. He placed it on the desk in front of Lena, the weight of it somehow making the room feel even more suffocating. "This is you," he said, sliding the file toward her. "This is everything." Lena stared at the file for a moment, her heart pounding. What was he talking about? Why was he showing her this? But she didn't hesitate. She opened it, flipping through the pages with trembling fingers. What she found inside shocked her to the core. There were photos of her, photos from her childhood, from her teenage years, and even more recent ones. But it wasn't just the pictures that sent a chill through her. It was the notes, handwritten notes that described events in her life that she didn't remember. Lena turned the pages quickly, her heart sinking with each one. She didn't recognize any of this. It was as if someone had been watching her every move, documenting her entire life. And then, at the very end, there was a letter. The man reached forward and pointed to it. "Read it," he said quietly. Lena's hands shook as she read the letter, her eyes scanning the words. Lena, you were taken from your real life. Your memories were erased. You were given a new identity, a new purpose. And now, it's time for you to remember. Time for you to return to who you truly are. The letter was signed with just a name that made Lena's blood run cold. Harrison Vale. She looked up at the man across the desk, her mind racing. Who is Harrison Vale? What does this mean? Why was I taken? The man's eyes were dark, but there was a flicker of something, regret, perhaps, behind them. Harrison Vale is me. And you, Lena, are a part of something much bigger than you realize. Lena's breath caught in her throat. He was Harrison Vale. But she didn't know him. Not like that. Not in the way the letter seemed to suggest. Her whole life, her entire identity, was a lie. I don't remember any of this, she said, her voice shaking. I don't remember you. I don't remember anything. Harrison leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled in front of his face. That's because we made sure you wouldn't. But now it's time to wake up, Lena. Time to remember who you are, what you were meant to do. Lena's mind was reeling. She couldn't make sense of it. None of it made sense. But she had to know more. She had to understand what was going on. What do you want from me? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Harrison's eyes locked onto hers. I need you to remember. You were meant to be part of something, a mission. We took you from your old life to protect you. But now it's time to finish what we started. Lena felt her stomach twist. A mission? What kind of mission? And why did she have no memory of it? Why me? She asked, the question almost too much to bear. Harrison didn't answer right away. Instead, he stood up, walking over to the window and looking out at the sprawling city below them. Because, Lena, he said finally, you were the key to it all. You always were. The words hung in the air, heavy and unspoken. Lena could only stare at him, the weight of everything crashing down on her. She was part of something bigger than herself. She was meant for something she couldn't even begin to understand. And as Harrison turned to face her, his expression unreadable, Lena knew one thing for sure, her life was never going to be the same again. Lena stood there in the silent, imposing room, staring at Harrison. The revelation from the last hour had shattered everything she knew about herself. The truth had come crashing down like a tidal wave, drowning her in its depths. She had never imagined her life was something more than ordinary, that she was part of something so monumental, so secret, that it had to be hidden from her for years. The window behind Harrison was framed by the city lights, casting a faint glow across his features. He was calm, too calm, and Lena could hardly believe the man standing before her was the same person who had just told her that she was once someone else entirely. Someone with a purpose. A mission. And now, she was expected to remember it. You've been living a lie, Lena, Harrison said, his voice unwavering. But you can no longer pretend that it doesn't matter. It's time for you to face the truth. Lena couldn't process it. How could she? Her mind was still reeling from the fact that her memories had been erased, shaped, manipulated, stolen. She wasn't Lena at all. At least, not the Lena she thought she was. The woman who had laughed at the idea of being anything other than ordinary, the one who thought she was just a simple woman from a small town, wasn't the real her. I can't, her voice trembled, and she stopped herself, afraid of how weak she sounded. But how could she not be weak? How could anyone remain strong when they were thrust into the middle of a life they never asked for? Harrison sighed, and the sound felt heavy, like a weight pressing down on her chest. You don't remember it all yet, do you? The memories, they've been carefully erased, but pieces are starting to slip back in. That's why we brought you here. Lena's head spun. Why do you keep saying, we? Who else is involved in this? What do you want from me? Harrison's eyes narrowed slightly. He studied her for a moment, as if deciding how much more to reveal. Then, he walked to the desk and opened another drawer. He pulled out a file, much like the one from earlier, but this one was thinner, almost like a pamphlet, with less weight to it. It was different somehow, but Lena didn't understand why. Harrison placed it on the table in front of her. Everything is in here. You've just been too scared to ask the right questions. But the truth has always been right in front of you. Lena's hands shook as she reached out and flipped open the folder. This time, there were no photos. Instead, there were documents, official-looking ones, with intricate details and what seemed like coded words. She couldn't read most of it, but some things were clear: classified information, operations, termination orders. The words danced in front of her, just out of reach, like a dream she couldn't quite hold on to. Harrison stood behind her, watching her closely as she tried to make sense of the pages. This is what we've been working towards. This is the reason why you were brought here. You're part of a much bigger operation, Lena. A network of people, agents, spies, people with special skills, who are all in place to protect something much larger than you or me. Lena froze. Spies? Agents? You're telling me I was a part of a secret government operation? Her voice was almost a whisper, as if she couldn't quite believe the words coming from her own mouth. Harrison nodded slowly, and there was something in his eyes now, something raw. Yes. You were chosen. Not just for your abilities, but for what you could bring to the table. You're the key, Lena. You always have been. She pushed the file away, standing up and turning to face him. No. This can't be real. How can I be someone I don't even remember? How can I have been part of something like that? Harrison's gaze softened, but it didn't lose its edge. I understand that this is a lot to take in, but you have to understand, your memories were erased for your own protection. There were people who would have used you, manipulated you, if they had known the truth. Lena's mind felt like it was cracking under the weight of it all. So what now? What am I supposed to do with this information? What do you want from me? Harrison took a step closer, his voice quiet but urgent. You're not just anyone, Lena. You're a part of this network. The memories are coming back. You have skills, knowledge, that no one else has. But we've lost control of the operation, and it's too dangerous for you to remain in the dark. Lena shook her head, her hands trembling. I don't want to be a part of this. I want to go back to my life. I want to forget everything. You can't forget, Harrison replied. His tone was harder now, more insistent. You can't go back. Not after everything that's happened. She felt the tears pricking at the back of her eyes, but she fought them back. Why me? Why was I chosen? I don't even know who I was anymore. Harrison exhaled slowly, as though preparing himself for something difficult. Because you were the one who could stand up against the people who wanted to control everything. You were the one with the courage, the heart to do what others couldn't. That's why we had to erase your memories, to protect you from them, to protect you from yourself. Lena felt her knees weaken, and she sank back into the chair. So, all this time, I've been living in a lie. Harrison's voice softened, and for the first time, she saw a hint of regret in his eyes. In a way, yes. But the truth was never meant to be easy. It's a burden. But you can handle it, Lena. You always could. Lena pressed her palms to her face, trying to hold back the overwhelming flood of emotions that were threatening to break through. Everything she had believed about herself was wrong. Her identity, everything she thought she was, had been a construct. A carefully crafted lie designed to keep her safe from a world she hadn't even known existed. You have a choice, Harrison said, his voice low. You can walk away. You can turn your back on all of this and pretend like nothing happened. Or you can step into the role you were always meant to play. You can fight for what's right. Lena didn't speak for a long time. She stared at the file in front of her, her mind racing. What was she supposed to do? How could she possibly accept this reality, when everything about it felt like a nightmare? Finally, she looked up at Harrison, her eyes filled with a mix of fear and determination. What happens if I choose to fight? If I choose to step into this role you're talking about? Harrison's face hardened, but there was something else there, too. A flicker of admiration. Then we fight together. We take down the people who've been controlling everything. We end this, Lena. But you have to be willing to face the truth. You can't back down now. Lena took a deep breath, feeling a sense of resolve begin to form in the pit of her stomach. The woman she had been was gone. The life she thought she had was an illusion. But there was still a chance to change everything. To reclaim what was hers. I'm ready, she said quietly, her voice strong despite the turmoil inside her. I'm ready to fight. Harrison nodded, his expression softening ever so slightly. Then let's finish this. The room seemed to close in on them, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Lena felt a surge of clarity. She had spent so long trying to understand who she was, what her life had meant. Now, she finally knew. It didn't matter that she had been lost for so long. What mattered was what she did with the truth now that it was in her hands. There was no going back. No escaping what was coming. But there was one thing Lena knew for sure now, she would fight, not just for the truth, but for herself. And in that moment, as she stood there facing Harrison, the weight of the decision hanging heavy in the air, she felt something else, something she hadn't felt in years. Hope.